The search for meaning is a loaded phrase that encompasses pretty much all schools of philosophy, from the days of Thales and the pre-Socratics, all the way to modern people doom-scrolling the more esoteric subreddits in search of an answer to that great existential syllable. Why? The search for meaning is related to, but distinct from, the search for purpose. An individual can find what they believe is their purpose, while still never coming to a conclusion in the search for a universal directive for the human race. In Hinduism, this concept is referred to as swadharma, the different responsibilities individuals must carry out to uphold the order of the universe. Not being an expert in Hinduism, I won't try to explain this concept fully, but from what I've read, there seems to be a correlation between an individual's station in life and their swadharma. There isn't a lot of wiggle room if you happen to think your individual purpose is completely different from the life you were born into. But no one told Ron Trosper that. The absurdism of I think you should leave comes from characters acting in an antisocial manner. Chair Company is built on small bouts of uncomfortable social interaction. The entire universe of the Chair Company is held together by absurdism, surrealism, individualism. A number of reviews I read specifically compared the Chair Company to the late by 25 years third season of Twin Peaks. What even is the main story of season 3? Fire Walk with Me was originally hated by fans. The death of Laura Palmer no longer interested them. The question of who killed Laura Palmer was the tree off which all the other characters and plotlines of Twin Peaks branch. When Ron leaves a scene, the one-off characters cease to exist as we, the viewer, follow him out, accepting the advice Netflix has been suggesting since 2019. I think you should leave with Tim Robinson.
Through the darkness of future past, the magician longs to see one chant sounds between two words. Fire, walk with me.
A single glance past the Chair Company's surface-level comedy will tell you that it's a story about a very lonely and very directionless middle-aged man who doesn't seem to realize that he's severely depressed. The major point of Ron's backstory is that he quit his corporate job at Fisher Robey to start a business running Jeep tours around his depressing Middle America hometown. It's not the best idea for a startup, but the show makes it pretty clear that it was Ron's dream, and a brief flashback shows us that when he started to realize his ideas weren't panning out, his wife and daughter had to treat him with kid gloves as if he were terminally ill. When the show opens, Ron has returned to his job at Fisher Robey, where he's been promoted to overseeing their big mall project and has apparently done a good job of repressing his disappointment. But when the infamous chair incident occurs, he falls back into depression over his failed business, and his insane investigation into Tekka sprouts directly from these repressed feelings. Ron may tell himself that he's doing a public service by exposing the criminal activity of the Chair Company, but in reality, he's chasing the high of a brand new life direction, and when he's not physically in danger, he seems pretty proud of himself for finding this tenuous purpose. Even though he hides everything from his wife, he reveals his working theory to his daughter in what seems to be an off-the-cuff decision. And while Natalie does seem to believe to a certain extent that this conspiracy is worth looking into, her initial reaction is one of concern, reminding Ron that she loves and supports him, and she immediately starts tracking his location. Like Laura Palmer, Ron Trosper can't see a way out of his current position in life. Unlike Laura Palmer, his position is stable and not life-threatening for the most part. There's obviously no comparison to be made between a cushy office job and living as a cocaine-addicted teenage prostitute. While Laura Palmer embodies a desperate sort of existential terror, believing she won't live long enough to escape the black hole she's fallen into, Ron embodies the depression and ennui of longing for purpose without realizing it. Essentially, Ron is subconsciously desperate to rekindle his sense of direction, to find the purpose for which he exists as a human being. Laura Palmer, on the other hand, has come to believe that she has no purpose to rekindle. She's just doomed to be used by others until her flame flickers out. Unfortunately, a sense of purpose does not equal a sense of direction. Ron develops a sense of purpose by investigating Tekka, but being unable to admit how much he needs excitement in his life, he also fails to outline a concrete reason for his investigation, other than the general sense that he has a civic duty to expose the chair company's criminal activity. Not that he goes out of his way to weed out other criminal activity. It's Tekka he's latched onto, and it's Tekka he will follow to the ends of the earth. And when he finally figures out the mystery, and the mastermind of the conspiracy tells him to his face exactly how her operation works, Ron is completely unfulfilled. He agrees not to expose Tekka, because doing so would ruin the business his wife built while his fell flat, and while this could have been a lesson about family being his true purpose in life, Ron doesn't seem to feel that way, at least not about himself. He goes out of his way to help Mike reconnect with his family, but this charitable act falls flat when he's told that the man he's come to see as a good friend may be seriously unstable. But Ron does try to reconnect with his family in the last episode after losing both his investigation and his job. He seems to be looking for a backup purpose now that his exciting adventure has petered out. He gets a new dog, a replacement for the pet he was cuddling in the flashback as he sat with the miserable knowledge that his business was DOA, and this dog is also taken out of the equation when it returns to its original owner. Ron is left with no comfort but his family, which he seems to take for granted. He doesn't ignore them or dislike them, but he seems to think that he's not as valuable as his wife or daughter, not without an individual purpose he can work towards and his family can support. Unfortunately for Ron, while he's not able to complete his mission of exposing the chair company, he's not allowed to step away from the investigation either, because there are higher forces at play. Yes, I am talking about Jason and Amanda, and the post-twist twist that Ron's inciting incident was actually significant, just not to Ron's entire investigation. But more so than that, I'm talking about Tim Robinson, and I'm talking about HBO Max. Because Ron exists at the beck and call of the unsympathetic deities that are the writers and the audience. And considering that the chair company wasn't planned out from the beginning, it seems entirely possible that as long as the show keeps getting renewed, Ron will continue to be pulled in different directions and down different rabbit holes. But as miserable as he may become in his futile search for purpose, Ron at least gets to appear and have some agency in his own show, unlike Laura Palmer, whose entire network-appointed purpose was to be dead. Not to die, to be dead from the beginning, with the viewer's only understanding of her being filtered through the characters whose abuse led to her death, and then finally to appear on screen, only to be trapped in the inescapable predestination of a prequel. From the very beginning of Dale Cooper's investigation into the death of Laura Palmer, it was shown that Laura's private activity went above and beyond the usual teenage shenanigans. As well as having two boyfriends, who definitely weren't on board with this throuple, she regularly partook in and possibly sold cocaine. Further investigation revealed that Laura had inappropriate relationships with a number of people in town, almost exclusively adults who actively abused her or paid her for sexual favors or straight up pimped her out. Early character witnesses like Bobby Briggs seem to imply that Laura was some kind of psychopath, actively hurting people around her for no apparent reason. But later revelations helped the audience realize that all of her bad behavior was a screaming plea for help, originally a reaction against the sexual assault she had been experiencing since age 12, and later a vicious cycle of self-destructive behavior that demanded outside help but simultaneously pushed away everyone who could possibly help her. Whatever Laura's intentions, her behavior was antithetical to the all-American homecoming queen persona she presented. That angelic persona was a one-dimensional mask that she never asked for. To the outside viewer, Laura seemed to fit this role perfectly, delivering Meals on Wheels and tutoring at least 2 people in her spare time. She was even dating the captain of the football team. Except that Bobby Briggs had also begun to slip away from his traditional role, thanks to Laura's constant need for cocaine and a hedonistic lifestyle that Bobby, for all his emotional issues, tried to steer clear of. Laura Palmer was never going to find purpose in the one-dimensional role forced on her by the people of Twin Peaks, but Bobby seemed to do exactly that. After a rocky start, he was inspired by the honorable and steadfast nature of his recently deceased father and ended up becoming a police officer, the ideal final form of an all-American small-town football captain. Could there have been a world where Deputy Briggs ended up married to Laura Palmer? In short, no, there couldn't have been, and it has nothing to do with Shelley or James. Laura Palmer in Firewalk with Me, the only time we see her alive at all, let alone dating Bobby, is a person with no future. As a human being, she has emotionally checked out from life, putting up walls around her heart, not to block people out, but to stop them from realizing she's burning to death inside. Jennifer Lynch's The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer reveals that Laura has an unhealthy preoccupation with death. She doesn't want to die, not enough to attempt suicide, but she doesn't expect to live a long and healthy life either, not without an angel stepping in to pull her out of her misery. Laura Palmer, as she appears in Firewalk with Me, is also a fictional character with no future. Her death has been written in stone by virtue of the movie in which she exists being a prequel to the story of her murder investigation. But the spirit of Laura Palmer that haunts the narrative of Twin Peaks is not without a future. She will exist in a limbo-like quantum state until the viewer watches Firewalk with Me and finally understands a fraction of what she's been through. Firewalk with Me finally allows Laura Palmer to exist as a character and not just a plot device. Meanwhile, Ronette Pulaski is still relegated to a secondary character in the tragedy of Laura Palmer, so while Laura dies staring into a mirror, Ronette, who must survive by definition of being in Season 1, only begs an unseen entity to see me. Twin Peaks wouldn't exist without the death of Laura Palmer. Therefore, in the prequel movie, Laura Palmer must die. As Laura and Ronette are attacked by Bob, they look to their guardian angel for help, but even the angels have no power over the pre-written destiny of a character in a prequel. Ronette finds her own angel in the form of Mike, who rescues her from Bob and fulfills the promise of the prequel that she will survive to appear in Twin Peaks, but Laura's personal angel doesn't come to rescue her until decades later, in the form of Dale Cooper. Taking the events of Part 17 at face value, Dale Cooper succeeds in his long gestating plan to step back in time and rescue Laura Palmer from the events of Firewalk with Me, physically moving her away from the area where Bob would have kidnapped and killed her. Taking the events of Part 18 at face value, Cooper's actions have allowed Laura to escape Twin Peaks, both the town and the show, and live the next 25 years under a different name. When Cooper finds her back in modern day, she's in her 40s and going by Carrie Page. This seems to indicate that Laura, as a person, successfully escaped Bob and the rest of her tormentors, while Laura, as a character, escaped her predetermined role as the inciting plot device of the Twin Peaks universe. When Cooper saved Laura as a person, he essentially killed her as a character, and erased the Twin Peaks we knew. We see the past actually changing when we revisit the opening of the pilot episode, watching Pete Martell leave his house to go fishing, but this time not being distracted by a body on the shore, because Laura Palmer has been erased back into life. As a person, Cooper has chosen to disobey the flow of time and the predestination of Laura Palmer, and as a character, Cooper has chosen to disobey the demand for Laura's death, without which none of this story would exist. The upside of Cooper's disobedience, which has kind of become a running joke among Twin Peaks analyzers, is that poor Pete finally got to go fishing in this timeline, which we see thanks to a fake Shemp standing in the shoes of the late great Jack Nance. Pete's fishing here is only possible because of Cooper's disobedience to the timeline and the metatextual powers that be. Essentially, a world that existed naturally and saw everyone obeying their preset destinies, like Pete finding Laura's body, has been replaced by a world that exists through artificial interference, changing the story and allowing Pete to finally go fishing. Because at the end of the day, there were only two possible timelines for Agent Cooper. The timelines where you fish or obey. To step in here and remind everyone, if you're enjoying the video, please drop a like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Joining this channel as a member, or subscribing to my Patreon, would go a really long way in helping me make more videos like this. For as little as $1 a month, my patrons get early and ad-free videos, and also my weekly serialized short stories, which essentially amounts to a full novel every 9 months. There's also comic books, art, CGI models, and I'm even working on programming a couple video games. Higher tier patrons will even get free copies of my novels, and speaking of novels, if you want to support Rico Talks, but you'd rather have a book in hand right now than piecemeal over 9 months, check out my historical science fiction novel When in Rome. Cooper's original role as an agent of the FBI was to identify Laura Palmer's killer, and his original role as a character was to reveal the extent of Laura's secret life to the viewer. Despite Caroline Earle, the Blue Rose Task Force, Philip Jeffries, Chet Desmond, and any number of important cases Cooper must have worked in his time, he is cosmically connected to Laura Palmer. Without a show predicated on her death, he would never exist as a character. The same goes for the rest of the cast, but Cooper specifically exists for the purpose of illuminating Laura's backstory. Once Laura is retconned from death, the universe these characters inhabit quite literally ceases to exist, the final dossier notwithstanding, and Cooper is set adrift to continue finding and rescuing Laura Palmer wherever she may be. He wants to eat his cake and have it too. After crossing through time and rewriting history to get Laura away from Twin Peaks, he immediately tracks her down and brings her back. Because Cooper isn't purposeless like Laura or searching for purpose like Ron, he latched onto his purpose and held it fast for 25 years at the cost of his entire reality. Cooper himself starts slipping away after saving Laura. It's all very ambiguous, but it looks a lot like his identity has been usurped by someone named Richard and Diane by Linda, and Cooper has a visibly different personality in Part 18 when he finally tracks down the not dead, but missing, Laura Palmer. Carrie Page was not living a perfect life before she met Dale Cooper. Without passing judgment on Odessa, Texas, we can see that her life there was complicated just based on the dead guy on her couch. While she may not remember her early life, she's still, for all intents and purposes, Laura Palmer, and Laura Palmer must suffer for Twin Peaks to exist. Carrie doesn't seem to be living on a knife's edge the way Laura was, but her paranoia and, again, the dead guy, could be interpreted as a realistic future for a Laura who survived. A Laura who was physically taken out of the fray. Bobby might have ended up similar to Carrie too if Laura's death hadn't sparked his transition into a more level-headed person. Cooper, unfortunately, only ever knew Laura the way the audience did, that is to say, as a plot device. Even in Firewalk with Me, when he claims to have a psychic understanding of the next victim's identity, he's incapable of learning anything more than what he knows in the pilot episode. Cooper struggles against the restraints of existing in a prequel and being unable to even acknowledge his specific goal to save Laura Palmer, in the same way that Chet Desmond was incapable of doing anything important enough to be mentioned in Season 1, and ended up vanishing from the narrative. Cooper's time-traveling rescue of Laura and his subsequent interference with Carrie comes across as essentially misguided. Sure, it would be nice to retroactively save a murder victim, but he does so at the expense of the entire universe, erasing the linchpin, pun intended, of Twin Peaks itself. And in Part 18, he takes advantage of this new post-Twin Peaks world to try rescuing her again, per his prime directive. And of course, we never know what happens in-universe as a result of this decision. But in a metatextual sense, you could interpret the sudden cut to black as Carrie Page remembering her identity as Laura Palmer, which leads to the realization that without her death, Twin Peaks has no inciting incident, Firewalk with Me is meaningless, and the entire universe has no reason to exist, which in turn leads to the delayed but sudden end of this universe, that is to say, this TV show. In the controversial 4.5-hour YouTube video, Twin Peaks Actually Explained, No Really, host Twin Perfect suggests that the haunting final shot of Firewalk with Me, in which Laura Palmer sits in the red room with Dale Cooper and slowly goes from looking somber to simultaneously laughing and crying, is a depiction of Laura Palmer, the fictional character, coming to understand the real-life purpose of her existence, to embody the inciting incident of Twin Peaks by being dead from the start. Twin Perfect believes that the flashing lights on Laura's face represent a television, and that her ambiguous laughter stems from a place of bitter irony. She finally understands the purpose of her existence as a character created by the governing deity of her reality, David Lynch, not to be killed, but to have never lived in the first place. I recently heard a fan theory that this scene takes place chronologically not right after Laura's death, but after the cut to black in Part 18, as Cooper and Carrie are transported into the Red Room, and Carrie reverts to her 16-year-old self, finally coming to understand and accept her identity and destiny as Laura Palmer. What if this scene occurs in Firewalk with Me instead of Part 18, because after that cut to black, there is no longer a medium for Twin Peaks, and Carrie must return to the past to find her true purpose, just like Cooper did? It reminds me of the infamous final scene of The Sopranos, with that cut to black that was even more frustrating than Part 18. People have been debating for 20 years what really happened in-universe, but the potentially disappointing answer has always been right in front of us. Nothing happened in-universe because the universe of The Sopranos ceased to exist with the last frame of the last episode. The Sopranos just isn't the kind of show that people discuss in the same way as Twin Peaks. Even with its surrealist moments, you don't see any of the DeMeo crew literally time traveling. Unless that's the secret explanation for the timeline issues in The Many Saints of Newark.
The coffee's ready if you'll have some. And breakfast should be finished soon.
Working with this concept of metatextual destinies, it's important to point out that Ron Trosper doesn't seem to have any sense for this element of his existence, which, yes, can definitely be implied in a character, even without getting trippy on the level of Twin Peaks: The Return. Ron is desperately searching for a purpose, or at least a direction, that can make him feel fulfilled as a man and as a human being, but he doesn't know that he's already fulfilling his purpose as a fictional character. Specifically, the lead character in a black comedy mystery thriller. To Ron, running from the cops or being held at gunpoint or investigating the local government offices feels like life or death situations, but only because he doesn't know what genre of show he's in. Unlike, say, the cast of Family Guy, who exists solely to regurgitate one-note jokes that fit their one-note personalities.
You think that's bad?
Ron considers himself a serious human being in a serious situation. So does Laura Palmer, except in her case, the gravitas of her life is not contradicted by the tone of the media in which she exists. Ron never understands that his inescapable purpose is to be funny, but Laura seems to realize in the Red Room scene, at least according to Twin Perfect, that her inescapable purpose is to be dead. Cooper, meanwhile, seems to staunchly refuse to understand that his purpose is not to save Laura, but to guide the viewer in learning about her. The bad news is that even with any amount of humility and self-awareness, there isn't an outer world whose enlightened occupants are capable of defining human beings as any particular type of character. At least, not that we know of. See my video about The Ring and Flatland. But the characters of Ron Trosper, Dale Cooper, and Laura Palmer can give us some valuable insight into the way we handle the emotionally draining and often unfulfilling search for a purpose that gives us a sense of individuality, if not a general understanding of what our entire species is even doing here. See my Evangelion video. Do we hyperfixate on the life we were born into, our swadharma, to the point where we can only define ourselves based on that role? Do we lash out at the machine that kept us trapped as a cog by forcing us into a purpose based on weak association? Or do we just accept that without the guiding hand of a showrunner and a bloodthirsty crowd of viewers, nothing is going to turn out as poetic or romanticized as we might be hoping? The most blatant example I can remember of acknowledging the viewer in a way that doesn't break the balance of the fictional universe is The Cabin in the Woods, where an Illuminati-like organization manipulates a group of 30-year-old high schoolers into embodying the archetypes of the slasher genre, going so far as to pump aerosol pheromones into the hot couple so they'll have sex in the woods and get slasherized. They do this to appease a group of Lovecraftian gods that demand routine sacrifice, specifically sacrifice in the mold of classic slasher movies. The gods are the audience, obviously, and their demand for the same storyline regurgitated annually is a not-so-subtle commentary on the state of the film industry in the early 2010s. The whole conceit of Cabin in the Woods centers around forcing fictional characters into particular boxes while they try to rebel against their pre-established roles. The same kind of rebellion Dale Cooper embodied by saving Laura Palmer. In sacrificing his investigation for the sake of his family, Ron Trosper also rebelled against the narrative, that being a show with a central investigation, but he wasn't happy to do it, and the show didn't let him off the hook either, throwing in the 11th hour twist with Amanda to keep the viewers viewing and keep Ron on the roller coaster. Any author will tell you that their fictional characters don't always obey them, which sounds pretentious, but I've personally found that it's absolutely true. Sure, no one but the author can put the words on the paper, but once you get a sense for your characters as three-dimensional people, you won't let yourself get away with forcing them to contradict their personalities. This coercion of characters, which authors with integrity will avoid, is exactly what the Illuminati people in Cabin in the Woods are doing. And I mean no disrespect to the late great auteur when I say David Lynch was doing the same, because he was self-aware about it. He needed Laura to be dead, otherwise the show he made a quarter century ago would be retroactively invalidated. But no matter how much amnesia and time travel and Richard and Linda stuff he threw at Dale Cooper, it was no match for the white knight syndrome and hero complex that sent our favorite Fed back in time to rewrite the show itself. I admit, the whole point I'm making here kind of falls apart when you remember that all these people are fictional characters whose every action and bit of dialogue is written by a real-life writer. Obviously, it's not actually possible for a fictional character to rebel against the plot or the script, but sometimes characters will take on a mind of their own apart from the author's intentions, to the point where you could have planned out every detail of the story from the start, but once you get to writing that pivotal scene, you realize that that character would never do that thing. But even after you figured out what they would do and how the story can possibly progress, the echoes of the original intent, the predestined path of the universe set by its extra-dimensional creator, still haunt the narrative. Ron Trosper will never find satisfaction, not as long as HBO Max, or at the very least Tim Robinson, plan for the streaming series he calls home to continue. And no matter what Dale Cooper does, Laura Palmer's death can never really be reversed. On another plane of existence, the story of Twin Peaks plays out in fits and starts, moving forwards and jerking backwards on the timeline, as the viewer gives meaning to Laura's struggle by doing what Ronette Pulaski knew had to be done: being seen and acknowledged, not by any sympathetic human beings in her own world, but by the eldritch gods who may feel bad for Ron Trosper and cry for Laura Palmer, but at the end of the day, are creating the necessity of the suffering of these characters just by watching TV.